Have you ever wanted to be forever young? Have you ever wanted to feel a little bit younger than you are? Or look a little bit younger than you are? I know that I have. I'm just as guilty as the next person. And I think that's because we all want to look like what youth feels like. Youth is infinite possibility. It's unlimited potential. Or at least it should be. We can all probably agree that that's what youth and childhood should be. I identify as a career educator and youth advocate, and I'm here to talk with you today about some of the concerns that I have in my line of work. I'm going to warn you that at times this talk is going to be a bitter pill to swallow. I'm going to be focusing on the United States. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I'm only going to tell you my top 5 concerns. Now, I may be biased. Let me contextualize. I may be biased because, when I was doing my Fulbright research, I was briefly kidnapped, and, then also there was a botched theft that same year, same research. So, by the way, that botched theft ended in several stab wounds. So, yes, it is true that I might be biased. That said, I have some concerns that I want to share with you, but I'm going to place them within the context of fights worth fighting, because I think that when it comes to young people, it's a fight worth fighting. We all have to fight it, and we can win. So for starters, concern number 1, it seems like every summer we are bracing for another outbreak of massive violence. 2015, the Charleston massacre. 2014, the Ferguson murder, Ferguson riots, and Eric Garner. 2013, a shooting in a Decatur, Georgia school. 2012, the Aurora theater slayings. And, of course, the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, in an elementary school. It's interesting because in preparation for this talk, I was looking through index after index of mass shootings, everything from InfoPlease to the LA Times, and what I found is that the United States monstrously outranks all other nations, developed or underdeveloped, in mass slayings, mass shootings, particularly those implemented by kids. And that's the other part of this. When it comes to mass slayings and mass shootings, generally speaking, you get 2 types. You get disgruntled employees who shoot in employment institutions, and you get kids. Kids who target key social contracts and institutions, especially schools. And while we're on the topic of schools, let's talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, please. Pipelining practices have resulted in the suspensions and arrests and expulsions of tens of millions of our students in recent years, according to the NEA today. In 2013, leaders and members of the NEA came together to demand that the pipeline be shut down. This is actually a very interesting quote, one that I consider to be a very courageous one, from a Denver disciplinarian who just says it honestly. He says, look, I was suspending upwards of 300 kids a year. And he says, honestly, it was a cop-out. It was just an excuse for kids not to go to school. And when you're a youth advocate, you know that's when you need to be most worried about kids. When they're getting suspended, they're getting kicked out, their parents might not know about it or might just not be in a position to do anything about it. Maybe they're at work, maybe the kid gets used to getting kicked out, they're outside all day doing God knows what. And when you're a youth advocate, you're usually the person who finds out what. Pressing further, the topic of human trafficking, I think it's important to discuss it specifically within the topic of fighting the good fight for kids. Because at this time, 1 in 3 children worldwide, according to the United Nations, is a victim of child slavery and human trafficking. But what about here in the United States? Well, I was looking at a very interesting info sheet on Proposition 35, the CASE Act, a 2012 initiative to fight child slavery and human trafficking, and it tells us that California, right here, beautiful California, is home to 3 of the FBI's largest child sex trafficking areas here in the United States. That's Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. But ironic, if you happen to be a Spanish speaker, those are the names of angels and some of our most important saints. Pressing further, I'd like to talk about changes to our children's immune systems. More specifically, sexually transmitted diseases are affecting our children now as never before in our nation's history. The CDC now recommends that all children ages 11 and 12 get the HPV vaccine series. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 11, when I was 12, I wasn't thinking about sexually transmitted diseases. I wasn't thinking about HPV vaccines. Now, all children ages 11 and 12 should be getting it. And here's the very frustrating thing. Dr. Ann Shukat, in the leadership at the CDC, she tells us, I'm frustrated because as of 2014, 4 out of 10 girls and 6 out of 10 boys is not getting the vaccine. HPV, again, according to the CDC, is the most commonly sexually transmitted disease. It's affecting roughly 80 million Americans at this time. I know it's a bitter pill to swallow, but I gotta tell you, it's affecting roughly 80 million Americans at this time. It's responsible for nearly all cases of cervical cancer and a majority of, let me make sure I get this straight, a majority of penile, anal, vaginal, vulvar, mouth, and throat cancers. There's a vaccine out there. We're not getting it to our kids. And I don't understand that. Why is that? Is it ignorance? I'm willing to buy that to some extent, right? To some extent, it's probably ignorance, and that's okay. And maybe it's income disparity. And here's number 5. Maybe it's income disparity. Because income disparity in the United States at this time can only be compared to the Great Depression. That's actually a little bit more like this. And our kids are very much at the receiving end of that. They're formulating their characters inside of this historical context. And they have the neurology and the stress and the hashtags to prove it. The National Alliance to End Homelessness tells us there's a whole new subcategory of homelessness. It's called unaccompanied youth and children. 7.8% of the homeless population in the United States falls under that classification. That's about 40,200 kids living in areas that are completely unfit for human habitation. And the kids that aren't directly affected by intense poverty are seeing the effects of it in mass communication. There's a very interesting term by a science writer named Linda Stone called the continuous partial attention span. This is referring to neurological brain waves that people are trying to use to describe the kind of brain waves we're seeing much more often in our young people now. Continually there, continually gone. Okay, but what does all this have to do with you? It's unfortunate. It's not very pleasant. But what does it all have to do with you? And by the way, have you ever noticed just how much of the word youth is comprised of the word you? How can I empower you to leave here today dedicated to doing something about this? To going beyond your comfort zone and helping a kid and joining the fight worth fighting for kids. Well, I don't know what your comfort zone is, but I know what mine is, and I'm going to go beyond it right now. I'm going to do it because I believe that doing that kind of thing, particularly for people in need, especially for kids in need, is a source of healing. Not just for me, but for you and for our nation. So here goes. When I returned from my year researching abroad, as I mentioned before, I had dealt with some very serious trauma. I had been the victim of a kidnapping, and on top of that, multiple stabbings, and I came back to the United States, and I found the recession in full swing. My friends were jobless, I was jobless, and all of the social networks that I usually relied on were gone. And anyway, even if they had been together, nobody would have been able to help me because everybody had losses of their own to deal with. I, on top of everything else, was dealing with a raging case of PTSD. Every time I thought about working with the kids that had previously inspired my entire life's work, I started seeing the faces of those kids who had attacked me. I'm a person who's trained to look into the faces of children and see what they need. And you know what? When someone commits a crime against you, you can see a lot about their soul in the way they commit the crime. And I had seen those kids' faces. You know, I couldn't admit that. Because, you know, if I'd admitted that in the time when I was being kidnapped and so on, you know, I would have been killed, but you know, I did see their faces. I saw a lot of what happened. You know, and of course, like I came home to the United States, I didn't want to work with kids anymore. At all. All I wanted was to be buffered and siloed against that experience. I thought, my God, I have done enough. I can't help kids anymore. I'm going to let that be someone else's problem. I'm going to just block that out. And gradually, on the advice of people who love me and people who know about these things, and you know, with therapy, I gradually, step by step, began to reconnect with the kids that I dedicate my life to. And not just any kids. Kids at risk. Kids with needs. We may be going through the United States' Downton Abbey moment, and we may be facing extreme circumstances, but that's all the more reason for us to reach out. And the more I connected with these kids, the more that I started to look in their faces again and watch them make different choices that they might not otherwise have made if I hadn't been there, the more that I saw them making changes in their own life, the more I found myself reconnected with hope, and I found that process to be deeply healing, a profound source of solace. I was rejuvenated. And I'm sharing this with you today because I believe that if you try this, you can do the same thing. So here it is, what I'm asking you to do. 3-step process. Number 1, find a kid. Find a kid. If you're not ready to work with a kid, find an organization that works with kids and connect. And number 2, and this is very important, you have to work with kids that are at risk, that are truly in need. Kids that if you saw them on the street, you would be frightened of them. And number 3, you have to give past your comfort zone. Not just give, but somehow give past your comfort zone. Because fighting the good fight really is like drinking from the fountain of youth. It is cheap, it is accessible, and there are so many children out there in need. I'm going to close today with a reference to the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize ceremony because it can be no coincidence that the winners of the Peace Prize were both youth advocates. One of them, a young person herself, Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan, stepped forward to accept her prize on behalf of voiceless children everywhere who want change. And Kailash Satyarthi from India stepped forward to accept his award. And he asked of us to act collectively with a sense of urgency, because every single minute matters, every single child matters, and every single childhood matters. Thank you.